What I'm sharing today are some of the preliminary findings of my doctoral project, which is a historical case study of the Confederation of Canadian Unions, or the CCU. And because this project is ongoing, I really welcome any feedback or questions or comments that will help me think through this project a little bit further. What I want to suggest is that the CCU isn't just a historical example of institutional experimentation, but also an institution that's left a legacy that I think today's labor movement can really benefit from. So first, I'll walk us through what the CCU actually was, and then I'll conclude with a few of the lessons that I think the CCU leaves for us. So the CCU was an independent labor central that formed in 1969 opposite the Canadian Labour Congress, or the CLC, which represented, and very much remains so to this day, the mainstream of Canada's labor movement. And even though the CLC was able to win very good wages and job stability for the white working class in the post-World War II period, immigrants and women and workers in unorganized industries were very much excluded from these benefits. And worse still, they bore the brunt of precarity during the global economic downturn in the 1970s. And the CCU, which was very critical of the dominance of American unions within the CLC, managed to organize new workers and new industries during this period, but also made some enemies along the way. And I think the most instructive example of the tension that the CCU created from breaking away from the CLC is the story of the Canadian Textile and Chemical Union, or the CTCU, which just so happens to also be the CCU's oldest founding affiliate. The CTCU was created by militant labor leaders Madeleine Parent and Kent Rowley, who were organizers with the United Textile Workers of America in Quebec during the 1940s. And Parent and Rowley led a series of strikes in the cotton mills of Lachute and Valleyfield to improve the low wages and the dangerous working conditions that were rampant in that industry. And in these strikes, many Francophone women rose to the ranks of union leadership and joined the picket lines. And aside from alienating the more conservative top brass of the textile workers, these strikes ran afoul of the anti-labor and stringently anti-communist premier of Quebec at the time, Maurice Duplessis. So Parent and Rowley had very loose ties to the Communist Party, but in the end, that really didn't matter. It was their commitment to labor activism that generated a very harsh anti-communist propaganda campaign against them. So under charges of seditious conspiracy, Parent and Rowley were jailed by Duplessis and later expelled from the textile workers in 1952. So Parent and Rowley formed the CTCU after leaving Quebec and organizing textile workers in Ontario. And in July of 1969, they were joined by several other breakaway unions from across Canada who had experienced some combination of the American union bureaucracy within the CLC, as well as the ravages of anti-communist persecution. So some of these unions included Mine Mill Local 598 from Sudbury, Ontario, which has a very radical history, but others such as the Pulp, Paper and Woodworkers of Canada out in BC, and the Canadian Association of Industrial, Mechanical and Allied Workers, which I'm going to shorten to CAMA because I'm not repeating that acronym again. So as a united labor federation, solidarity between the CCU and its various affiliates was very strong, but breaking away from the CLC created a lot of enemies in the labor movement. So to improve its network of allies, the CCU found common cause and built very important relationships with the Canadian left and the women's movement. So in 1969, a youthful and radical faction of the New Democratic Party, or the NDP, comprised of students, workers, and new leftists, formed what was called the Waffle, with the purpose of achieving an independent socialist Canada. And one of the ways that the Waffle sought to achieve this independence was by strengthening the Canadian labor movement, particularly by supporting independent unions. In the early 1970s, Wafflers proved themselves to be very valuable allies in two CTCU-led strikes in the textile industry, first at TexPac in Brantford, Ontario in 1971, and then again at Artistic Woodwork in 1973 in Toronto. And in both of these strikes, the Waffle mobilized youthful leftists in service of better wages, better working conditions, but ultimately respect for the Italian, Greek, and Portuguese immigrant women on strike. And in turn, these women mobilized in support of a left nationalist and independence-driven politics. Unfortunately, the Waffle was a very short-lived endeavor. The top brass of the NDP expelled the Waffle from its ranks in collusion with the CLC, who was very much the main benefactor of the party, and in some ways still is. But in contrast, the CCU enjoyed a very long-lasting relationship with the Canadian women's movement. And I think the most important development that accounts for that longevity is the cross-pollination of various CCU leaders with the upper echelons of the organized women's movement. Namely the fact that Madeleine Parent had a position on the National Action Committee on the Status of Women, or NAC. NAC was a very broad coalition of feminist activists and politicians from various political persuasions, and they were formed in order to implement the various recommendations of the Royal Commission on the Status of Women, which was tabled to the federal government in 1970. And several recommendations from the commission focused on improving women's economic and working conditions, such as ghettoization into low-paid industries, equal pay for work of equal value, and a lack of maternity and parental benefits. And these were all issues that Parent had advocated for in her tenure as a labor organizer. So she could rally NAC's infrastructure, funds, and members in support of CCU-led campaigns, strikes, and organizing drives. And in turn, women in the CCU benefited greatly from the educational programming, the organizing support, and the financial assistance that an organization like NAC provided. Now, since its formation, the CCU championed an overtly nationalist politics that favored Canadian autonomy in the labor movement, but also within the Canadian economy. And it began as a very narrow nationalism that rejected the American dominance of the CLC, but very quickly it expanded into a wider economic nationalism that advocated for things like the nationalization of key industries, as well as safeguards against unfettered American investment. And with the advent of free trade in the 1980s, the CCU launched sustained critiques and campaigns against what would eventually become NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. So joining networks of anti-free trade activists, such as the Coalition Against Free Trade, exposed CCU members to the very polarized politics of this trade agreement, and it allowed them to hone their political praxis and deepen commitments to class and labor outside of just their immediate workplace. But it's also very important to note that this nationalism that the CCU championed wasn't a narrow or an exclusive nationalism that pertained only to Canadian issues, nor was it exclusionary, an exclusionary form of a racial or ethnic politics. Actually, on the contrary, the CCU's politics lent itself very well to calls for labor autonomy in other parts of the world. So in South Africa, for instance, the South African Congress of Trade Unions, or SACTU, was working to organize Black South African workers within an economic and political framework of apartheid. So throughout the 1980s and the 1990s, the CCU worked very closely with SACTU to build an independent and anti-racist labor movement in South Africa. In January of 1990, for instance, the CCU provided critical financial aid to the South African transport system strike, and it even petitioned management to negotiate with strikers in good faith. And the CCU also worked with SACTU to petition for the release of anti-apartheid activists, namely Nelson Mandela, and used the worldwide celebrations of his release in order to educate the membership about issues surrounding apartheid. But by the late 1980s, the Canadian Auto Workers, or the CAW, broke away from the American United Auto Workers. And what that did was bring various UAW locals across the manufacturing, extractive, and service sector under Canadian control. And at the same time, public sector unionism in Canada had reached critical mass. And I think the best example of that is the Canadian Union of Public Employees, or CUPE. So by the end of the 1980s, the CCU wasn't the lone voice in the Canadian labor movement advocating for independence. And accordingly, many affiliates either merged with the CAW or they remained independent. And I will just note that the CCU does still exist today, but it's very important to note that not only is it a fraction of the size that it used to be in the 1980s, but it also has a much different political mandate, just based on the fact that, at least in the public sector, a lot of Canada's workers are organized under Canadian unions. So I'm just going to conclude, again, very quickly, so I don't hold you from dinner, with a few things that I think are the key historical lessons that the CCU leaves for today's labor movement. So first, with the erosion of NAC and with the NDP's seemingly continued march towards the political center, this has meant that formal ties between organized labor and a radical political left and women's movement has declined quite substantially. So to build a network of alliances that can marshal rank and file workers and adequately represent marginalized workers, I think today's labor movement needs to realign itself with radical feminist and radical left-wing politics. But I will readily admit that that also requires a very serious realignment within both the Canadian left and the women's movement. Secondly, because of the vastly unequal political and economic capacities of states that are operating in the global economy, Canadian economic and political independence, I would argue, is just as relevant a question today as it was in the 60s and 70s. Now, I'm not sure just how productive renewed left nationalism would be, especially given that it would have to present a very strong alternative to the very racist and right-wing nationalisms that operate today. But I do still think that some kind of political praxis that allows workers to identify sites of domination and oppression, both within capitalism and the labor movement, is needed, as well as a theory that provides some kind of channeling of resistance against these forces. Thirdly, I think the CCU reminds us that we have to be sensitive to the hardships and the conditions faced by workers across the global economy. So international solidarity in the labor movement, now more than ever, I would argue, is a key means through which workers in various jurisdictions can achieve better work. And lastly, there's been a really impressive growth of unionization and labor activism in the service sector. For instance, Starbucks workers in Canada and the United States have been joining unions very rapidly, either independent ones or ones affiliated with the steelworkers. And these unions are dealing with a lot of the same issues that CCU unions dealt with 3 decades ago. Things like precarity of work in the service sector, low pay, little benefits, little leverage with employers. So the service sector has also proven itself time and time again to be ripe with diversity, with many women, immigrants, and racialized workers making up a massive demographic of that industry. So the labor movement needs to sustain its attention here and also look for other underrepresented sites of work if it wants to recoup its numbers that it once boasted and organize a large swath of the working class. So I'll just conclude by saying that I think the legacy of this organization has to live on if workers, both in Canada but also across the world, want to achieve not just better work, but a better society. Thank you.